Hello, my name is Kasia. I'm a little bit stressed out about the time limitation. I've been warned. I'll do my best, and if not, I'm going to tell you where to find more. So I'm going to tell you about the project that I've been working on for the several last months. It was a project with a community on open datasets for LLM training. And this project, I've done it with a colleague at Mozilla, but also in partnership with Alluter AI. If you don't know them, they are a fantastic independent AI research lab, open source research lab. And Sebastian Maestrovich, who's part of it, he's sitting there. He's standing up now so that you know that you can bombard him with questions as well. He's much more technical than me if you have any after the talk. This project is part of a bigger series of efforts that Mozilla is doing to create space for conversations with the leaders of open source AI space, because if you went to the keynote of Mitchell this morning, you definitely are aware of that there is a lot of disagreement, different opinions. What does open source and openness mean in the context of AI? The definitions are flying around and so on. Not everybody agrees, but we are all part of a one bigger tent. So Mozilla wants to create a space to have this discussions, to ask the right questions and to find answers one by one to the thorny questions, and possibly create some common artifacts like definitions and things so that we can start looking in a common direction, because the kind of, the fight that we're fighting, the enemy is really dominant and huge. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the project, how we brought people together to talk about what are the challenges of putting together open data sets for AI training, like what is the way forward, what are the successes out there, and what are the recommendations, where can the investment come. It's a story of community, it's of frustration in the community struggle, PDFs, and a lot of successes and hope as well. So what's happening right now? Right now, almost no one releases the data sets that have been used to train AI anymore. And OpenAI doesn't do it, Meta doesn't do it, Google doesn't do it. We talk about open source models and so on. Even DeepSeek, as you probably know, we talk about this being an open source model, but the data set that they use to train it is not revealed, it's not released, it's not even open in any way, as you see later, according to one of the definitions we have here. And while the data, of course, is the fundamental element of AI. So how did that happen? In the beginning of generative AI explosion and so on, there were still some data sets being released by Llama 1 or RT5 by Google. However, as you probably are aware, the copyright outrage, the copyright lawsuits that followed with a lot of creatives not being happy with their data being scraped by the big companies and exploited to train hugely successful generative AI, this copyright lawsuit created a lot of legal risk and a lot of fear in that industry from releasing data sets. So most of these big companies stopped releasing the data set because the lawyers basically told them, like, no, that's just too risky, we're not doing that. That, of course, in addition to the competition pressure in the industry. And that pertains both to the big companies as well as small research lab as well. There's a lot of legal risk in releasing the data. However, of course, we know we are here in the open source community. There's a lot of advantages to open data sets. Open data sets bring about competition so that smaller players can build on the data that is out there. It's about accountability and transparency, and of course also research. So we can and we have to do better. So what we did at Mozilla, we organized this dataset convening in June 2024 together with Alluter AI, when we invited people who are actually building the open data sets, who struggle with that and who succeed in that. And there are around 30 leaders of that field from a range of organizations here. You can say Hugging Face, Gretel with the synthetic data, Playas that was featured here before, mentioned as part of the Builders project, Spawning, really great organization as well. So a lot of people, we even I reached out on LinkedIn to people, and everybody was very eager, like, yeah, let's meet and let's discuss it, because it's a real mess and we're trying our best, but it's hard. Although we, as you can see, we're very happy at the end. We're kind of laughing. And as a background for that, we interviewed Alluter AI, Stella Biederman, who's leading the building of the open data sets at Alluter and Playas as well. It's a French organization to understand what the challenges are and to have like a common background for these discussions. Based on that, we created a research paper that you can access later on, and I'm going to, it's just made out of the community insights that we derived from that workshop, but later on also like asynchronous collaboration. And I'm going to give you a little overview of what's in that paper. Of course, it's not that much time, and I'm scared already. So it's just a short overview. So first of all, oh, that used to be a graph.
It's just slow.
It's slow. All right. All right. Okay. Well, it appeared. So we try to order kind of the space for us. So what do we mean when we talk about the open data sets? And there are these 3 tiers of openness in data sets for AI, starting with the sufficient documentation, that's the replicable data sets. That aligns with the Open Source Institute's definition. Right? So you need to document your data sources and the processing steps so somebody could replicate a substantially similar equivalent data set based on that. And these are the data sets such as CR4 or MC4. The second tier is the open access, so the data availability. So the data set is out there for everyone to download, but that doesn't make any claim about the licensing of it. And the third one, what we call here the fully open, is if there are all 3 elements, and there's the legal side of the usual, open data definition that we know from Open Knowledge Foundation, where you can reuse, share, and modify the data, and that pertains both to the kind of licensing of a data set itself, as well as all the kind of components that go into like image, text, and so on. And then, of course, we didn't only talk about open, because open data sets alone aren't enough. There is also the aspect of like what makes a data set fair, just, equitable, and ethical, and also compliant. And this is something that is important to remember, that these are 3 different notions that sometimes are even at tension with each other. They intersect, but sometimes you have to make decisions as you build a data set. For example, offering an ongoing opt-out might go against you wanting to have a stable version of a data set over time. Alluter and Playas told us a lot about like what are the challenges right now if you're trying to put together an open data set that is just made out of openly licensed content and public domain content, and these are a lot. So a lot of stuff is making their head explode every day. First of them is that laws vary across jurisdiction and time. So if you're trying to assemble an open data sets that will have global implications, you need to look at multiple jurisdictions and geographies, but that also change over time. And that requires usually legal expertise from different lawyers from across the globe, which is, of course, very expensive and very time intense. There is also a very big challenge around the metadata being incomplete. So what constitutes a work in a copyright law doesn't always translate so neatly into the different components. So for example, if you're crawling automatically a website, or Common Crawl crawls it and sees that there is a CC license on a website, in an automated way, it's not really possible to say if that pertains to all the assets of the website, or is it just an image or a text. So you can make many mistakes there and make yourself legally vulnerable. It's the same problem with the public domain, where the status isn't always so clear, and you need to do a lot of manual digging, which I know that Sebastian is really spending his days and months with manual digging. The same goes, another problem is just because a document is actually in the public domain doesn't mean that you can get a copy of it. A lot of stuff of cultural institutions and so on aren't digitized, or even if they digitize, for example, with the project of Google Books, you can't always get a full public access to it because it requires different arrangements with Google and so on. The problem with PDFs that I also learned from Sebastian about is that extracting open data from PDFs is extremely difficult. There are no real tools that help you do it in a scalable way, and it requires a lot of manual labor, which of course requires a lot of resources and people and so on. As you know, many open source projects are made out of volunteers. They don't have a legal entity. Being exposed to legal risk requires a lawyer, requires a legal entity, and so on. That's another problem that arises in this AI context. And finally, there's something called the consent crisis right now, where people don't want to, even originally open data, they don't want the AI scrapers to scrape the data because they are, of course, annoyed with the data being used into the big data sets. And that is directed at the big company, but at the same time, for example, with robot takes in and so on, that blocks out also researchers and independent developers and so on. But of course, we don't want the big tech to exploit the open data that is out there, so there's also that kind of problem that we might maybe solve with an AI commons that is set up in a right way. So we spent 8 really intense hours together. I have to say the food wasn't really good, unfortunately, but people were amazing, and we had a lot of discussions around the pipeline of producing such open data set, did a lot of exchange. And we came up with the best practices that are really grounded in what people are actually doing, the different organizations building the different open data sets. And I'm not going to go through all of them because that maybe would be too much, but I invite you to check out the paper in detail. But one thing that comes ahead of everything is really the encoding the preferences in metadata. The problem of not being sure if something is licensed or what is the preference of the data owner going forward is that it doesn't allow building data sets in a very scalable way. And other than that, there's a lot around working with communities, around a lot of documentation, making the open data sets reproducible, and so on. There is also a lot of emerging examples. Eluter AI is building Playas, building a common corpus that already training models on it. They also have a so-called toxicity classifier, so they open source the pipeline of how to identify toxic content. The same Hugging Face, the Edu Web Classifier is also an open source pipeline. They just like open sourcing the methodology of like how to go through the data sets and remove the harmful and toxic content, of course, documenting the definition, how they define that harmful content, and so on. There's also experiments around data trust, of how to organize the governance around data for communities, so they have a say about what's happening with the data sets, and so on. And Spawning is also an amazing organization working on data governance, letting people opt out of the data set, and then creating API for developers to run through the data set and remove that data from it. So a lot of great examples. We have even more of them, all with links in the paper. And finally, we also identified what needs to change in terms of policy and what needs to change in terms of tech investments so that we can move forward as a field. And I identified here 3 main points, so to say. So increasing open data availability. Again, here, making it easier to identify the status in a reliable way of public domain data, having maybe registries, working with cultural institutions, in partnership with cultural institutions to digitize data and establish the metadata for it. AI data commons is something that's been discussed all the time, but like who can finally do it in a way that is reliable, and such concrete things as I mentioned, the tools to extract openly licensed content from difficult formats like PDF. And of course, clarifying the legal status of the data. So one proposition there was that policymakers could create a safe harbor, especially for smaller organizations such as Eluter AI, that they can make some mistakes around licensing, but they don't need to fear that immediately they will be slapped with a lawsuit. And then, of course, that they don't have the resources to fight. So having a safe harbor for that would help a lot, as well as invest in this global metadata standards to manage licensing and consent and scale. And here the consent is meant as a nuanced consent that goes beyond the robot takes the crawl, not crawl, but like for which purpose can this data be actually used. And finally, as always, the money, ensuring the sustainability of the ecosystem. So if we want the open data sets for AI to be out there, to be really meaningful so that we can build open source AI on them, they need to be treated as public goods. And that means they need to be financed as public goods with a long-term perspective of sustainable funding. And alternatively, also thinking about sustainable business models here. So what would that look like? That's always a problem, I guess, in the open source community, because things are open to use. You can't really sell them. But there's Wikimedia, experimenting with the Wikimedia enterprise from what I know, and then there is also spawning, thinking about the freemium model and thinking about how to give back also to the communities that are giving out their data, and how to develop something that is more sustainable so that we can all move forward. So that's very short. And thank you. This is the QR code. That would be too much to type. If you want to check out the research paper. Also, if you want to contact me, I'm actually leaving Mozilla, but I'm connected with that project, and I can answer all your questions and direct you to the people at the company.
Thank you very much. Do I have questions?
How do you plan to handle the attribution requirement for open license content?
Yeah, I have the microphone. Yes, it's true. Attribution, I've been thinking about it. Maybe Sebastian also can give his opinion on that. But I heard about people actually giving attribution en masse, listing or one as part of the documentation, of course, or linking to linking to this kind of repositories. But I don't know if there is. I think it's like one of still maybe some of the unresolved issues. But Sebastian, maybe if you have an opinion of how to handle that at Luther.
It's one of the hardest problems, so let's talk about that. I think best practices right now, when there's datasets released, effectively mean they're part of the parquet file when you have a dataset or something. It's just another column, right? But is that enough? Is that sufficient? Is something that the community really needs to talk about. But we really try hard to get attribution for every single item that is licensed under Creative Commons licenses.
Thank you. Do I have more questions?
That was great, thank you very much. So quick question. Are you going to turn, I've not read the report, but are you going to turn it into something machine readable so that another machine can fully understand, and that means that new providers, not the ones that just talk to you, can also implement it as well?
Machine readable, can you?
So everything that, everything that's in there described, like what the intentions are and stuff like that, it's machine readable in the same way.
Yeah, the metadata being machine readable. Yeah.
Yeah, so that a machine can also read it. Yep.
Yeah. No, I think that's the whole crux in it. That it requires manual labor. So the trick would be to make this so you can pull the data that you need and be sure about the license, sure about the signal preference signals, so that it must be machine readable. Otherwise, it's just like picking log one by one and checking and requiring a lot of resources, time, and that will never reach the same level as OpenAI and so on without that.
Do I see more questions? And I don't. Thank you very much.
Thank you.